Logging has been a major part of the West Coast historical legacy since the late 19th century, and the industry has contributed to the success and prosperity of many communities in Oregon, Washington State, and British Columbia. At the heart of the whole operation were the legendary lumberjacks. They were men who harvested trees by cutting them down with axes or crosscut saws. In those early years, before the arrival of modern equipment, logging was a physically demanding job that required a combination of brute strength, stamina, and technique. The word lumberjack is rarely used these days and has been replaced by the term faller or logger. Although logging was usually an exclusive male domain, many women, known as lumberjills, worked in the industry during World War II when there was a shortage of manpower. The lumberjills depicted here worked in the Queen Charlotte Islands and took over all aspects of logging-related operations with considerable success. Throughout the West Coast, lumberjacks usually lived in logging camps, and in British Columbia, one of the first camps was established at Cowichan Lake on Vancouver Island in 1885. The camps consisted of bunkhouses for single men, and in some camps, family houses were erected to accommodate men and their wives and children. Most camps had a cookhouse with a kitchen and dining hall, and a Queen's Palace, as it was called, for single female cookhouse workers. After a hard day's work in the forest, a comfortable camp, good food, and plenty of it, kept lumberjacks happy. Cooks were an important component in logging camps, and first-rate cooks could attract and keep the best workers. Logging camps usually had a blacksmith shop where smithies repaired and manufactured equipment. Some of the most important employees in the camp were the saw filers. These skilled tradesmen made sure lumberjacks started work every morning with well-tuned equipment. Lumber camps were usually racially segregated. The Chinese, Japanese, and Sikh workers had their own bunkhouses and cookhouses. Friendships were not unheard of between the ethnic groups, but they were rare. In some of the camps, one event that brought the workers together was Chinese New Year. This annual banquet, full of good cheer and bottles of whiskey at every table, ensured that everyone had a good time. Unlike coal mining camps and factory communities, logging camps were not permanent fixtures. When the area near the camp had been cleared of its loggable trees, the camp would be dismantled and hauled to a new location. Later, when railways arrived, each building was actually a modified rail car that remained on the tracks. Temporary walkways and steps were placed outside so that people could get in and out of the buildings. Wages were low in the logging industry, and working conditions were often dangerous, with a high rate of injuries and fatalities. One of the mottos in the woods was, "Be quick or be dead."
I'm at home in the wildwoods wherever I be. Though dead broke, skedaddler is free. While I sit by my fire and my baccy I blow, I heed not the cold winds, the frost or the snow.
When I think on the past, I can't see I'm in fault. Though I worked like a horse, yet I never made my salt. When my prospects were blighted, they stopped on my jaw. And though honest at heart, I'm nowhere an outlaw.
Yet though cleaned out and fizzled, I do not despair. There's a land far from this one, I soon shall be there. And if Providence leaves me my hands and my health, the skedaddler may yet win both honor and wealth.
I'm dead broke, so I've nothing to lose. I've the wide world before me to live where I choose. I'm at home in the wildwoods wherever I be. Though dead broke, the skedaddler is free.
Logging had a unique division of labor and was based on the various tasks each person in the operation was required to perform. The faller's job was to cut the tree down and control where it fell. Once it was down, the bucker cut the tree into sections. The faller and the bucker used two different types of saws, especially designed for each operation. In order to stay supported higher up on the tree where it was easier to cut, the fallers used springboards, which also gave them extra leverage because they moved up and down with the weight of their bodies. Fallers cut notches into the base of trees and attached boards on which they would perch. Fallers often worked in pairs. An experienced pair could fall a 3-foot tree in 15 minutes and a 9-foot Douglas fir in 4 hours. It was the faller who usually yelled out "timber" after a tree was cut and came crashing to the forest floor. Fallers and buckers usually attached a bottle filled with kerosene to the tree they were cutting. The kerosene acted as a lubricant to ensure the saw passed through the wood smoothly without getting stuck. Each night the saws would be taken to the filers in the camp, who would sharpen them. Loggers were often superstitious and would only take their saw to a favorite filer. In the late 19th century, logging technology was in its infancy, and the industry was dependent on ground lead yarding. This was a slow process whereby logs were dragged horizontally out of the forest on skid roads by draft animals like horses or oxen. The logs were then placed in rivers or flume channels for further transportation. Horse-driven logging wheels were also used to raise logs off the ground so they could be more easily moved and were less prone to jamming. The constraints of this process typically limited logging to the vicinity of usable waterways. One of the biggest breakthroughs in the logging industry was the arrival of steam donkeys. They were used to haul logs by means of a series of steel cables wound around spools on the donkey decks. Steam donkeys were the first form of mechanization and soon became standard equipment in most logging operations on the West Coast. The donkeys rested on wooden skids and came in many sizes and shapes, but they were cumbersome, consisting of a boiler and steam engine. They were hauled by horses or dragged around logging sites by using their own power and a system of winches. Some steam donkeys, called walking Dudleys, were used for unloading logs, and they were propelled on wheels and traveled on rails. A combination that did not always have the best results. Once the trees around rivers were harvested, railroads were used to reach further into logging sites. Eventually, railroads became the principal method for transporting logs. Steam donkeys were stationed by the tracks, and they reached out with long winch lines to drag the logs to the landing, where they were loaded onto rail cars. Various types of steam-powered locomotives, including the Climax and Shay models, were used in logging operations. The Shay locomotive was originally invented by Ephraim Shay, but underwent many modifications over the years. It was capable of delivering equal torque directly to wheels on both sides of the engine at the same time. This overcame the dynamic force of the common rod engine, whose normal piston strokes jerk the engine side to side on each stroke, delivering excessive force to the rails, especially on the curves. The Shay was also popular because it provided power to each wheel through a crankshaft. Shay locomotives could be found throughout the West Coast because their unique gearing system provided pulling power on steeper inclines. Safety was not always a priority during many logging operations. Besides the inherent dangers of felling trees, railway mishaps were not uncommon, with boiler explosions and derailments being the main culprits. In general, logging was one of the most dangerous undertakings, both in the forests and on the rails, claiming thousands annually and injuring untold more. Logging has been an important part of the history of Squamish, dating back to the late 19th century. Early settlers in the Squamish Valley, like Charles Schoonover and Harry Judd, logged to clear the land and used the wood for buildings and fences. The traditional log cabin was one of the mainstays throughout the area during this early period. At the start of the 20th century, Squamish was slowly being transformed from a farming to a resource-based community. In 1907, the Howe Sound and Pemberton Valley Railway moved logs for the Norton McKinnon Logging Company near Masheter's Landing. Unfortunately, a company fire in 1913 resulted in the loss of McKinnon's business, and he left Squamish soon after. Around the same time, the Yap Timber Company began logging operations around the Chikai area and eventually hooked up with the Pacific Great Eastern Railway to haul logs. Another logging operation was undertaken by Allen and Charles Barber, who had the first steam donkey in the area. Al Barber was also partners with Chief August Jack. Al would bring the logs through Brackendale on skid roads, and then August Jack would drive them down the river and place them in booms in the Squamish Harbor. Unfortunately, the Barber brothers lost their steam donkey in a poker game, but their logging operation continued well into the 1930s. Eventually, large-scale logging got underway with the arrival of railroads. In 1912, the Pacific Great Eastern Railway began construction of a railroad from Squamish to Pemberton, which was completed a year later. To attract investors, they started calling the downtown area of Squamish Newport. Few people liked the new name, and by 1914 it had reverted back to Squamish, derived from Squamish, a name the Squamish Nation had given the area. Brackendale pioneer Harry Judd started the first taxi service in Squamish and transported loggers to and from camps in the valley. Most of Valleycliff and the Squamish Highlands were still heavily forested in the early part of the century, and an American logging firm, Merrill and Ring, started operations in 1926 east of the Squamish River in Valleycliff. With a steam engine salvaged from Norton McKinnon's company, Merrill and Ring continued laying down track from what is now the log dump south of the Squamish Reserve to Valleycliff and across the Mamquam River. The company then expanded their lines, accessing Edith Lake and Cat Lake, which is so named because Merrill and Ring brought in a Caterpillar tractor to log around the lake. Around the time of the First World War, high lead yarding was introduced and replaced ground lead yarding. High lead yarding was a major breakthrough because now cut logs were raised and transported to a landing by cables suspended from spar trees. The cables were powered by steam donkeys. With the logs partially or completely raised, it was much easier to move them out of the forest. High lead logging created a number of specialized jobs, such as whistle punk, chaser, and high rigger. The whistle punk's job was to sound a whistle as a signal to the yarder operator controlling the movement of logs in the air and on the ground, and act as a safety lookout. Whistle punks had to be alert and think fast because the safety of others depended on them. The whistle punk was often a youth, possibly a new camp member, or sometimes a disabled logger. Whistle punks jerked the whistle wire running from the logging site to the donkey in a combination of long or short blasts based on the Morse code. The high rigger, also known as a tree topper, used ropes or cables and iron climbing hooks attached to his boots to ascend a tall tree in the landing area. He would climb the tree, chopping off limbs as he ascended, chop off the top of the tree, and then attach pulleys and rigging so the tree could be used to transport logs into the landing. Choker setters attached steel cables to the logs so they could be hauled to the landing by the yarder. The yarder was responsible for moving the logs from the site where they were cut to a transportation point where they would be hauled away for processing. Once the logs were at the landing, the chasers removed the cables and readied the wood for loading. Choker setters and chasers were often entry-level positions on logging crews. With the arrival of high-lead yarding, spar trees were essential to the operation, so if a spar tree was not readily available, one would be raised where it was needed. This spar tree raising took place during the 1940s on the west side of the Squamish River in Brackendale. By the end of the 1930s, the limitations of railway logging were becoming more evident. Not only were tracks expensive to build, but they could only access gentle forest slopes. With the arrival of the internal combustion engine, logging became more mechanized. Tractors with cat tracks could reach deeper into the forest by cutting new roads, and they could haul logs from previously inaccessible sites. Another major breakthrough in the logging industry was the arrival of the arch. Many styles and shapes of arches have been used to assist in moving logs. The tracked arch, shown here, is a classic, though arches with rubber tires were often used with smaller bulldozers. The arch provided two distinct benefits. First, by raising the logs, they could be freed from hang-ups and obstacles, like stumps, for example, that might be in the way. Secondly, logs drag a lot easier if they are partially lifted off the ground. Trucks with rubber tires eventually eliminated the need for railways at logging sites. One of the major legacies of the logging industry are the roads which opened up new terrain around existing communities. Many have been incorporated into the road systems throughout the West Coast. In the late 1930s and throughout the 40s, especially after the Second World War, logging was becoming the main economic engine in Squamish. In order to expand their business and open new, steeper areas to harvesting, Merrill and Ring introduced truck logging at the south end of Brome Lake. The company left Squamish in 1940, but by then many of the workers remained and joined new logging companies. Among the other logging companies operating in Squamish during the 40s and 50s were Empire Mills, Squamish Mills, Chris Nygaard, and CRB Logging. In 1944, Dennis DeBeck and his partner John Brunson set up a sawmill at the southwest end of Brome Lake, and by 1950 they had moved the operation to Alice Lake. House Sound Timber was also active around Brome Lake. As the demand for timber resources increased worldwide, large firms like Macmillan Bloedel and Empire Mills, which eventually became Interfor, began to log the Ashlew, Elaho, and Upper Squamish valleys. Falling trees was hard work and time-consuming, so various machines were devised to make the process easier, like this steam-powered saw, or this early gasoline-driven reciprocating saw. None of these contraptions were very effective, and they were eventually replaced by the gas-powered chainsaw. In 1929, German mechanical engineer Andreas Stiel patented the first gasoline-powered chainsaw. These devices took much of the backbreaking labor out of tree falling and made logging faster and more efficient. Another breakthrough was the chipper chain invented by Joseph Buford Cox in Portland, Oregon in 1947. His innovation greatly improved the cutting efficiency of chainsaws and reduced the amount of sharpening required. As the years passed, chainsaws went through various modifications, both in size and shape, with some proving to be more efficient than others. the 1950s, rail and highway links from Squamish to the lower mainland were constructed, giving the community access to new markets. By the 1960s and 70s, the forestry industry in Squamish was booming, and there was a ready supply of jobs for local residents like Al Harry.
See, when I first started getting into the logging industry, I worked at the mill, and I was working as a cleanup crew. And mostly just worked on Saturdays, Friday, Saturday. And that was just for us young guys, like high school kids that wanted to work. And but after that, then I went to work in, it's part of the logging industry, but it was on the blooming ground. I was right on the water. My dad got me that job. Those jobs at that time, you start at the bottom, and you had to do a lot of running around, and which was good. I mean, I was in shape then, and I could run fast, and I had good balance, so I was really good on the booms. We almost got killed a couple of times, or falling trees, and jackknives and branches coming down off of the trees. Come close a couple of times. And I got hit by a log right in the head, across the eye here. I got about 19 stitches inside my eye and 17 outside my eye. And I remember that part. I was got hit by a log that was behind a skidder. It wasn't my fault too. I guess it was my fault because I was in the wrong place, wrong time. But I had my share of injuries. Jobs in them days, they were a dime a dozen. You could finish one job, and somebody will come and ask you to go work for them. If you were good at what you did, jobs always found you.
Electric power, video feeds, and control circuits. The sonar system and 8 onboard video cameras allowed the sub to move underwater without touching the lake floor. Staying off the bottom reduces the amount of silt that gets suspended in the water. The operator works in a control booth on a barge, directing the robot to the base of a standing tree. A hydraulically powered grapple grabs the tree, and the sub screws a large air bladder to the trunk and inflates it. After the sawfish saws the trunk with its 40 horsepower electric chainsaw, the bladder lifts the tree to the surface. Workers then remove the bladder and the tree's limbs. In 3 hours, the sawfish can cut 37 trees. The logs are then sent to a conventional lumber mill for processing. By the late 20th century, a variety of highly efficient forestry harvesting machines like this Feller buncher further revolutionized logging. A Feller buncher is either rubber-tired or tracked with the power plant, operator enclosure, and an articulating extendable arm onto which a felling head is attached. The felling head consists of grappling devices in either a disc saw or a chainsaw. The operator moves the machine into position in front of a tree and maneuvers the felling head to the tree trunk. The grappling devices wrap around the tree and the saw cuts the tree from the stump. The machine then takes the severed vertical tree and lowers it into a horizontal position onto a pile on the ground. With the arrival of trucks and heavy machinery, logging companies could reach farther into forests and up mountains than ever before. Logging companies operated on the land and underwater, but there were still many areas that were not easily accessible and could only be reached by helicopter. The access problem was solved in 1971 when the first heli-log trial was completed by OK Lifts Limited using a Sikorsky S-58. OK Lifts Limited was a division of Okanagan Helicopters, the predecessor of Canadian Helicopters Corporation. A second successful trial was conducted in 1974. Heli4 Canada Corporation is a heli-logging pioneer. In 1978, Heli4 leased a heavy-lift Boeing 107 helicopter to log mountain slopes along the inlets of British Columbia. Since that initial trial, the 107 has logged continuously with an annual production of over 200,000 cubic meters. The birth of heli-logging has revolutionized the industry. It has changed logging from a ground-based operation to one that has escaped its terrestrial boundaries, and it has opened up previously inaccessible territory. Today, there are in excess of 40 helicopters in British Columbia dedicated to logging operations. extracting more than 3 million cubic meters of timber annually. Helicopter logging is being used increasingly as a response to the growing environmental controversy relating to traditional logging methods. On a helicopter site, the timber is fallen in the conventional manner, but instead of being transported to the landing with a log skidder or a yarder, the logs are hooked to a skyhook hanging beneath the helicopter and flown to the landing. This minimizes ground disturbance.
Crazy dangerous. Crazy dangerous.
I'm busy.
And they've even gone even more automated from that now. I don't know if they'll get into it, but if not, I will. The automated yarders where you can remote control them from your living room. It has been the last couple logging conferences. I mean, they want robots for everything that they do. They want, and they've got robots that can do it more efficiently. But logging, ancient things, been since Bible time, and always seen wood, always seen logs.
The logging industry has been under considerable pressure in the past 2 decades because of forestry practices, like clear cutting, that have been unsustainable and environmentally damaging. Various organizations and individuals have been actively involved in changing how the industry operates, with a greater emphasis being placed on treating forests as a renewable resource. Steve Miles is one of the principals of CRB Logging, which has been active in the Pemberton-Squamish corridor since 1954 and is one of the few remaining forestry companies still operating in the Squamish area.
I'm quite concerned these days because it seems like people don't really care much or don't appear to care that the forest industry survives in our area, and it is very important because it is one of the few things we have here as British Columbians that is sustainable. We practice reforestation as opposed to deforestation like other parts of the earth do. And it is one of the few things that we have as a society that should maintain our lifestyle similar to what we had in the past and hopefully give us a stronger one in the future. But if we don't continue to practice forestry and logging and replant it, I got a feeling that we're going to have a real problem in the future with infrastructure. I believe we should definitely consider forestry as a big part of our past, a strong part of our present, and it should be a huge part of our future. And please support forestry. It is a renewable resource. It will give us our livelihood. It is still the biggest industry in British Columbia.
The history of logging on the West Coast has been the story of innovation and invention, of advances in technique and equipment. The industry has sustained many small communities throughout the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia.
Yep. And the truth is, these people love
It has
the environment
generated
more than any of
legends
these
and vivid stories
environmentalists.
about the exploits of lumberjacks and high riggers, and it has spawned celebrations
about
like the annual Logger
reforestation
Sports Festival in
and
Squamish.
All of the
But the heart of
timberland
this industry
owners
has
that we
always
work
been
for
the men and women who toiled in the forests,
replanted
lived and worked in the logging camps, and labored in the
after they
mills.
logged. So
This
clear
presentation has been dedicated to their memory.
is not what they say it is. It's not like we just clear cut here, and there's even already laws that you can't clear cut so many miles or before having to take a break. But they replant within 3 years.
Whisper softly, whisper in my ear. Whisper something so I can hear the sound of your voice. So very near, the sound of your heart. So very clear. Whisper softly, whisper in my ear. Whisper something so I can hear the sound of your voice. So very
can't take that away
near,
from
the
us.
sound of your heart. So
already started a nursery growing seedlings for timberland replanting. That we have a tree shortage here. They're trying to burn us down. These environmentalists over here have been destroying this logging industry since the 90s. Now, there's a bunch of lies about how logging was damaging our environment. And I believe that until I did a logger, started working in the industry, discovered that these men were actually dedicated for generations to life to this industry. So very near and the sound of your heart. So very environmentalists I ever met who spent most of their time, in the city, not out in the environment. So these are the true environmentalists here, the loggers. And, it's definitely something that is sustainable. And, they told all the loggers in the 90s to quit logging. Just stop. Leave it. Leave the forests. And so after a fire, they would just leave it and not log it, not cut the trees down. And so what you would get is a area that was full of already burned, all the greener is already burned, and you have a bunch of kindling just waiting to get ignited by pretty much anything. I mean, your tools can cause a forest fire to start in the heat of summer when there's no moisture in the forest and in the air. Of course, a lightning strike, anything like that can start a fire. So, they told us don't forest, don't log. All the logging in the 90s, the whole industry crashed. All these mills shut down around where I grew up, and you couldn't log. And so the logging roads weren't being maintained. So it all just overgrew. Our whole forest overgrew. And then they've literally been catching our towns on fire since 2020. They've been starting fires in this state. So if you've been following any of the forest fires on the West Coast the last decade, you'll know it's been just extreme, way more extreme than it has been in the past 40 years. And it's because of bad forest practices that were handed down by the government. So anyways, I hope you've enjoyed this rich history of this noble occupation that has been around since biblical times. And hope you can all come out to visit the trees in Oregon someday. Love to have you.